Good afternoon, everyone, and good day to everyone who's watching this program on the live stream. Of course, the energy security, affordability, sustainability are cornerstones of a successful energy transition. But is there one pathway or many pathways to the energy transition? We're going to discuss this in the context of an ongoing and undergoing energy crisis, but also a climate crisis that is unfolding over a long time. I'm Arunabha Ghosh, CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. I will be your moderator for this session. And just to kick us off, I just wanted to outline a few important ideas, at least I feel, that would shape the conversation today. The first is that there is not one but many energy transitions. There's, of course, access to energy that is still missing for hundreds of millions of people across the world. And that has to happen by the end of this decade as per the Sustainable Development Goals. There is also shifting patterns of energy demand in the fastest growing cities, especially in the global south, which will change how buildings are heated and cooled and how transport systems develop. There's also going to be the need to develop this growing energy sector within a rapidly shrinking carbon constraint. And what's also going to disrupt energy markets is the greater integration of new energy demanders into the energy system. The question for me, and I'm going to, of course, pose it to our eminent panel, is will the urgent trump the important? We are in the middle of an urgent energy crisis, and energy security is critical. But at the same time, what would that mean for the sustainable energy transition? Will we double down on the energy transition, or is this a time for a pause and rethinking it in a different way? We talk about the energy trilemma: access and affordability for households. We talk about energy security for the economy. And we talk about sustainability for the planet. But the energy trilemma is not back. I think it just never went away. And different countries have dealt with it in different ways. Again, we'd like to hear about that from our panelists. And finally, this whole conversation around energy is happening in the context of a macroeconomic crisis that is also unfolding. I just came away from in the Khor Park area on the evolving debt crisis in many low-income and middle-income countries. We also see the scale of investment that would be needed in the energy sector, both in maintaining the systems as they are and in transitioning to a completely new energy system. And we are also seeing potential trends towards protectionism or islands of regulation that might slow down the transition. So those are the kinds of questions in my mind. But let me turn immediately to the panelists. We've got with us Minister Irene Velez Torres, the Minister of Mines and Energy of Colombia. We've got Mr. Sumant Sinha, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Renew Power. We've got Mr. Darius Adamczyk, Chairman and CEO of Honeywell. And finally, we have Mr. Josu Jon Imaz, the CEO of Repsol. Those of you who are watching online or live tweeting, please use the hashtag WEF23. The general question I have for all of you is, how has the global energy crisis changed how countries and companies view the energy transition or transitions? Minister, first you.
I'm gonna speak in Spanish, if you don't mind.
Thank you. The current crisis, well, we have seen this as follows. We are currently facing a point where, in spite of the rising prices, and there's an impact on supply, for instance, particularly in Europe, climate target commitments have not changed. Countries in the north, especially European countries, have ratified their commitments when it comes to emissions and their reductions and decarbonization of their economies. And for us, this is a very important message in that we know that hydrocarbons economy will be devalued as coal has been devalued. And this has an impact, and it's different when we talk about consumers and especially in the north, and when we talk about hydrocarbon producers. Perhaps that's the main reflection or remark that I wanted to share. When we talk about fair energy transition for producer countries who rely on export, on hydrocarbon exports, for instance. Because there, we're not only talking about technology transition when it comes to generating energy and transforming the energy matrix and decarbonizing that matrix and how to integrate and embed renewables, but also we need to generate other sorts of economies at local and regional level. And our challenge, therefore, goes beyond energy. To achieve global transitional energy, we need to transform or reach transition at local energy level, and I mean production transition. And this requires investment not only in renewable energies, but also in other productive sectors that will enable us to strike the right economic balance so that we can carry out the transition and to stop extracting coal, gas, and other hydrocarbons. This is the major challenge. How can we achieve this transitional or this fair transition, and how can we take into account all the different elements, and how can investment support us so that we have a productive model that is more knowledge intensive, that is more climate friendly, and that looks at food production, bioeconomy, tourism, in a way that when the global economy is decarbonized, us as a producer country have also transformed our local and regional economies.
Sumant, Minister has just talked about it's not just an energy transition, it's actually almost an economic transformation. But does the current crisis slow that down? Or what's changed, what's unchanged?
Well, Arunabha, thanks a lot. You talked about the energy trilemma, access, affordability, and
security.
Sustainability.
Yeah.
Sustainability actually was a third one. And actually what I was going to do was to add a fourth one to that,
right,
which is now security. And that's something that has really risen right to the top of the whole energy dialogue. And in a way is now beginning to impact the other three aspects of the energy trilemma. I think in every country has a different way of looking at it, because every country has a different set of requirements, different set of needs. Developing countries, for example, have obviously access and affordability as very important aspects. For European countries now, security has become very important. So I think every country is therefore looking at it very differently. But I think behind all of this, the fundamental question, in a way, Arunabha, that you're asking is, what happens to the sustainability aspect? Does that still stay as strong as it was earlier, or does that get trumped by any of these other factors? And my suspicion is that, and my sense is, especially in talking to all of you here, is that I think in the short run, certainly people are focused a lot more on security. But I think the whole concept of, or the issue of sustainability is still there in everybody's mind as well. So people are trying to take decisions that do not impact sustainability from a long-term negative standpoint in solving the urgent problem. They're trying that, not always that it is easy to do, but that's the attempt. I think eventually in the near term, let's say the 3 to 5 year horizon, I think a lot of the energy security issues, to my mind, will get addressed. And then the whole issue of sustainability will again take even more center stage, because we know that the solution for sustainability, which is in some ways renewable energy, also leads to security, and also leads to affordability, and also leads to access.
So I'm going to come back to how we make that happen. But clearly you're giving the message that even if the urgent is dominant right now, we've not forgotten the important. Darius, is that a similar message for you, or you're seeing it differently?
It is a similar message. I completely agree. I think, this goes back to Maslow's pyramid. I mean, sort of having energy. I mean, there is a real urgent component. I mean, the energy footprint has changed by the events that occurred in the world in the last 12 months. And the first priority for a lot of countries was, how do I supply my country with energy? Because if I don't have energy, I can't support my citizens, I can't operate my economy, I can't do much of anything, really. And so the urgent was and continues to be a priority. However, and I think this is really important, I don't sense that any of the countries where their energy footprint was disrupted have forgotten about renewable energy. I think it's actually been an accelerant to move this. But you have to be able to take care of your citizens, your country, as the first option, because we can't sustain we can't have a sustainable life form without energy. But I actually think the disruption of the energy footprint in the medium to long term will actually be very positive in terms of driving sustainability.
From Europe, does the world look different? You're right in the heart of this crisis.
I mean, not necessarily different. I mean, going to your point about the trilemma, what I see is that in the midst of this energy crisis, what we are seeing is that in Europe we are failing in our energy transition roadmap. Because we forgot the trilemma. The trilemma has to guarantee the security of supply, affordability, so competitive prices, and decarbonization. And in Europe, we forgot the first two items, and we put all the focus on being sustainable. And we failed in security of supply, building dependence on Russia. We failed in terms of affordability, and today European families, they have problems to pay their energy bills, and industries are shutting down because they can't pay the energy. And let me say, I have the perception that we are also failing in terms of decarbonization, because we are very happy saying that we are reducing emissions, but what we are doing in many cases is sweeping them under the carpet, because we are exporting industries, jobs, and emissions to some other parts of the world. I mean, today, the cement and the steel Chinese sector combined emit as much as CO2 as the whole Europe. We import these products. We don't have any kind of concern about the origin of these CO2 emissions. We are happy. We say that we are reducing emissions, but let me say, there is a lot of greenwashing behind. And I think that we have to be realistic. We have to decarbonize the world. But I mean, the magical thinking is not good to do these kind of things. I mean, saying that, I mean, we are going to get rid of oil and gas. I mean, it's okay. But we are going to need oil and gas in the future. Oil demand is growing. Even in a world fully decarbonized, that will be great, 2050, we are going to need a lot of oil. And oil, I mean, to produce this carpet, to produce all these devices we have here, pharma. Energy transition means lighter cars, lighter planes, more insulation. So we are going to need oil. And we are going to need more gas, because the source that is growing, unfortunately, in the world is coal. So we have to guarantee, in a sustainable way, oil production, gas production. And we have, let me say, that is not about accelerating or slowing down energy transition. It's about developing a more intelligent energy transition, focusing in these three targets and accelerating the decarbonization.
Okay, so no magic wand in my hand right now, but you've highlighted, actually, Josu Jon, another trilemma, another potential trilemma, not just on the energy side, but what is potentially called the trilemma between jobs growth and sustainability. So, Minister, if I may come back to you, you talked about this, you are finding alternative dimensions to that, the productive side of the economy. Colombia has put out some quite aggressive decarbonization plans. 2 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, Colombia also upgraded its NDC to reduce emissions by 50% by the end of this decade. How does this fit in? How will you do it effectively? You know, what's that intelligent plan to do this while transforming your economy?
Yeah. Me parece
I think it's important to point out that for us, energy transition doesn't only involve CO2, a reduction of CO2 emissions. This is one part of our transition, but the other major part is to see how we leave behind carbon and hydrocarbon sectors and to survive as a country. And perhaps for us, that's the main dilemma. Our industries have to decarbonize, but we emit 0.5% of CO2 emissions at world level. So we have challenges, and our major challenge is linked to stopping deforestation in the Amazon and how we can transform extensive cattle breeding models. So it's not only within our industry, but how we manage our biodiversity and how we can prevent economic pressures from impacting our emissions. For us, when we talk about employment and other issues, we have to see how we can conduct this transition. Let me give you a specific example. There's a carbon corridor at the north of our country. Glencore, one of our businesses, this is a multinational, decided to leave because coal wasn't profitable in 2020. Now we have 5 municipalities that are bankrupt because they are not obtaining any royalties. How can we replace this local economy so that we can ensure it is sustainable and socially reliable, so that we have or we take into account all these more complex issues when we talk about global decarbonization?
Minister, if I could come back to exactly that, because you've highlighted with a very real example, that it's not just the transition away from the physical asset or even the financial asset, there is also a human asset associated with the existing energy system. What is that pathway in a just way for Colombia?
Nosotros estamos en
Currently, we are developing an energy transition roadmap that will include our decarbonization targets, which we acquired in Glasgow. That's the 51% by the end of the decade. We are looking at the decarbonization of our industry, and we're also looking at our productive model and how we can leave coal behind. As for coal, we have committed to not opening new open mining coal mines, because we know that coal importers will not import this sort of coal. Therefore, we need to quickly find another alternative economy for this. And we will not grant new prospecting contracts for gas and oil. This has been quite controversial at national level, but this is a clear signal about our commitment towards fighting climate change. We know that this decision, which is at global level, is urgent, and therefore we need immediate action. When it comes to fiscal policy, for instance, how are we going to cope with this? There's pressure to have an agricultural and farming industry. We need tourism. We also need renewable energies to generate new economies with the democratic levels, with energy communities. And for this, peace is very important. To leverage this, we need to make sure that there is peace everywhere. And that's our target, and especially when we look at environmental and social and justice elements.
Thank you. Sumant, if I could turn to you. The Indian energy transition actually began quite some time ago. In 2010, when the National Solar Mission began, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar. And now there's more than 60,000 megawatts of solar. You and your company have driven a big part of that story. So what changed in the policy framework through the past decade or so that enabled this rapid rollout of renewables in the Indian system?
I think, Arunabha, that the biggest thing that changed was, I think, just ambition. I think the government just essentially decided, via Prime Minister Modi when he became the Prime Minister in 2014, that solar was going to be a fairly big part of our energy mix. And at that time, solar was actually quite a lot more expensive, if you recall, in 2014,
Right.
than renewable energy. But at that time, we set a target of 175 gigawatts by 2022, which is quite a gutsy thing to do, given the price differentials. But I think what then, of course, subsequently happened that further sort of boosted the effort was the fact that solar became a lot cheaper. And from 2018, 2019 onwards, solar was just so much cheaper than everything else that it became a much more commercial sort of a, argument to have more and more renewables in the system. Wind also came down substantially. And today, therefore, the biggest driver for renewable energy in our grid is not any government mandate. It is really the fact that commercially it's the cheapest source of new electricity. And that is really now what is driving in some ways the rollout of renewables going forward. Now, as you well know, the government has resized the target and extended it out to 2030 and made it a 500,000 megawatt target, which, by the way, for those of you who know India, India's power demand is growing at about 6 to 7% a year. And so even if we get to 500,000 megawatts of renewables, that will not be sufficient to meet the demand growth that is going to happen in the entire country. And therefore, we will need more sources of power as well. So to my mind, fundamentally, in the beginning, it was ambition and aspiration. And the second really was the fact that it became cheaper. The whole ecosystem got created, and that then made it much more commercial to drive growth forward. And now, of course, as you know, we have many, many companies that are operating in the system. Everybody understands the value of solar and wind for that matter. And you know, you talked about the trilemma, the second trilemma, which was around
jobs,
growth, and sustainability. And again, for me, there is no, trilemma at all, because to me, the three again go hand in hand. You know, if any country now wants to grow their economy faster, I think to me, renewables is absolutely a way to do that in terms of creating a new industry, creating new manufacturing capacities, and thereby creating jobs, and hopefully bringing the cost of electricity down. So when countries which actually don't have access today talk about the fact that that they're being asked to sort of have more and more renewables as opposed to follow the same carbonization path that everybody else has followed, and they complain about that, for me the answer is, guys, you have an incredible opportunity that you can actually create your energy system from a very early stage and make it decarbonized and cheaper and cleaner to begin with. So this is, so to me, actually, there is no dilemma at all or trilemma at all between the three aspects.
We'll come back to you, Sumant, in terms of how that outlook or that optimism looks out into the future as well. But before that, I want to bring in Darius. Darius, throughout the annual meeting in Davos this year, there's been questions around supply chain disruptions. It's one of the themes that keeps emerging. How are companies like yours that have global footprints, dealing with these disruptions in global value chains? How is that impacting the way you are approaching the energy transition, your own plans for decarbonization, not just as a scope 1, scope 2, but even as scope 3? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel, or you're figuring it out as you go ahead?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to remember that we shouldn't be completely surprised by a lot of the supply chain disruptions, because given geopolitical events, as well as a pandemic, which we haven't had since 100 years ago. And the world is trying to adjust to sort of these cycles of extreme demand to no demand, which, I think the demand, frankly, just kind of fell off the cliff in March, April of 2020, and then came back extraordinarily strong in 2021 and to some extent 2022. So we're seeing these extreme peaks and valleys. And let's be honest, supply chains are not built for that. And to operate economically viably, suppliers, companies have to cut back dramatically when they saw no demand, like in 2020. And now they're trying to catch up and build back supply to catch up with the new demand. So we shouldn't be completely surprised we are where we are. You combine that with some of the geopolitical events that we saw, it just tells you that the supply chains are probably a little more fragile than we'd like them to be. So what are we doing, and what's the world doing? Is number one is, supply chain resilience and optionality is becoming much more important. And that's something that we're doing and we're building out, both in terms of footprint of our supply base, working with our suppliers to actually help them have the right capacity on hand, but also creating optionality of supply. Because if you're completely dependent on a single supplier, well, you're at much greater risk, and you have to build in it. And I think that that applies to the world of energy, that applies to a lot of various segments, whether it's electronics, energy, and so on. And I think we've changed our strategy in making sure that our supply chains are much more resilient, can operate with optionality. We're on that journey, and it's not complete yet, but we certainly made a lot of progress in the last couple of years.
I heard yesterday in another panel, Darius, someone saying, look, exactly what you're saying. It's not about, shouldn't be surprised by these disruptions. So running a business under uncertainty is the norm. Certainty or predictability is a nice to have. But the question still comes back. When you're trying to bring in optionality, it of course increases costs. So how are you then optimizing for investment decisions and additional costs? So do you see that optionality over time will actually reduce your costs?
Well, sure. Economics always play a role. So I mean, you're trying to bring to our customers the best quality, the best offerings at the lowest cost. I mean, that is sort of the economic equation, and we're trying to balance those things. It's a different answer depending upon what the supply chain is, but yes, it probably net has some inflationary pressure, because obviously if the one benefit of consolidating your supply chain, it may have some economic scale benefit, and if you diversify, it might have less. But it's all a balance. So it's whether you have an 80-20 kind of an approach, or you look at alternative supply bases. I mean, as always, what we try to do is we try to do both. We want to be able to provide the best offerings at the lowest possible cost, and we're not saying, okay, now we're going to just optimize for optionality, or we're just going to optimize for cost. We try to keep that in balance as much as we can.
Best offerings at lowest cost is really something that anyone at the fuel pump is always worried about, including politicians. So, Josu Jon, when you are thinking about your long-term net zero plans for decarbonization plans for 2050, as Repsol has put it out, what does the current disruption in the global economy, in the energy markets, do in terms of those plans? Are you recalibrating the target, or are you recalibrating the near-term, interim actions you're taking? Walk us through those difficult decisions a little bit.
First of all, we were the first oil and gas company in the world committing with the net zero emission target 4 years ago. What is more important? I mean, we have a clear, comprehensive roadmap year after year to reduce the carbon footprint of the company and our products, including Scope 3. 15% by 2025, 28% by 2030, and so on. I mean, and all the incentives within the company for all the people, including me, are linked to this target. Okay. And we have recalibrated over the last 3 years, twice, this target, increasing the speed of the roadmap. Why? Because we are seeing technological evolution that support that. 35% of our CapEx is devoted to the new energies. That's a quite unique case in the oil and gas sector. And we are making a great effort, of course, in the renewable power sector. We are going to be operating 6 gigawatts by 2025 and 20 by 2030. But, I mean, sometimes we identify electrification with decarbonization, and that is a half-true, lie. Because, I mean, electricity is not going to be the solution in coming 1 or 2 decades for an important part of the economy. Perhaps a half. Right. I prefer to be humble, a 40, 50, or 60%. Right. We are not going to see electric planes, right. Electric maritime sector. No, I mean, not in a mainstream way. Heavy trucks, whole industrial sector. So we have to decarbonize liquids and decarbonize gases. And the great effort we are doing now is the effort of producing these liquids, transforming the concept of our refineries. Our refineries are shifting towards a new multi-energy hub where oil is still there as feedstock, but we are adding vegetable oil, wastes, animal fats, products coming from the pyrolysis, circular economy.
Right.
And that is very important because, as the minister said, we have to be careful about our industrial jobs. We have to sustain our industry. We have to sustain our competitiveness, the welfare of our society. So the trilemma is there because, I mean, if we don't do that, we could lose these industrial jobs and the competitiveness of our economy. So we have to be fully focused in this decarbonization process under the principle of technological neutrality with no biases, but focus on protecting jobs and people in this decarbonization process.
2/3 of the way into this conversation, I am seeing two themes emerge. One, that there is a bright future in the energy transition and a range of economic opportunities, and the other, that there is a current challenge. Minister, you've repeatedly referred to looking at communities, looking at forestry, looking at the energy sector, the economic sector. But I would ask you to take a step back and look at the region. Is the problem slightly more easily managed by more regional cooperation? Are there more regional frameworks towards this? Any reflections on this?
Sí, la región.
Yes, the Latin American region is the region that has the biggest potential for development of renewable energies around the world. And that has to do with the PV potential in Chile, in the Atacama Desert, photovoltaic energy, and it also has to do with the water wealth we have from the mountains, the Andes, that goes all through the continent. In the Colombian Caribbean, we also have PV potential, as well as a huge potential to develop wind generation onshore and offshore. And we also have other possibilities as well. We believe that Latin American energy integration is essential so that the region as such can act as a single unit so that we can decarbonize our national energy matrices, so that we can achieve more competitive energy prices within countries and among countries, and to try and help decarbonize the north of the continent, because our renewables can have a push in that. And that Latin American integration is one of the goals we ratified last December between all the governments in the continent.
Sumant, Josu Jon says the trilemma exists. So back at you, just 2 weeks ago, the government of India announced the National Green Hydrogen Mission, which on paper is the world's largest green hydrogen mission, 5 million tons of production by 2030. In an era of high interest rates, debt crises, energy disruption, the exciting road that you've traveled over the last decade, do you see that financeable over the coming decade in terms of grabbing these new opportunities?
So, Arunabha, I think responding to your question a little bit and also responding to my fellow panelists' observations, look, I think the solution is the following, and I'm speaking a little bit broadly here. Number one, we need to electrify as much of energy as possible.
Sure.
Right? Number two, we need to convert as much into renewable energy as possible. Certainly, a lot of the future growth should be driven by renewables rather than by any other source of electricity, and that's something that most countries should talk about. Now, as he rightly said, electricity represents only maybe a quarter of the entire energy value chain. And therefore, we need to have solutions for the balanced 3/4 of the energy system. And that's really where the hard-to-abate sectors come in. But there's a lot of work going on right now in finding technological solutions to those areas. And in talking to everybody, I do get the sense that this whole sector is going to evolve a lot faster than we expect. Now, what that means is that there's going to be demand for green hydrogen, because that's really what allows us to address the hard-to-abate sectors quite substantially. And therefore, you will see the development. It'll take time, but you'll see a lot of momentum picking up in green hydrogen over the next 5 to 10 years. And certainly that then allows us to move into the other parts of the energy value chain. The question, however, is that today oil and gas obviously is a huge part of the energy system. how does that transition happen for the oil and gas industry? There's not going to be, it's not going to be this thing dials down, this thing dials up, and everything is smooth. There's going to be lots of volatility in that whole process. And unfortunately, there's no single entity globally that is going to be managing this transition. Nobody's going to say, you oil and gas companies keep declining 5% every year your production and keep investing that into renewables, and everybody else will keep investing. And so everything is going to increase. So unfortunately, it's going to be a pretty bumpy road as we go forward. And it is going to be something that is going to lead to issues and uncertainties. And that's where the point that he's making, which is that you need to continue to invest in oil and gas, is absolutely fair. I don't disagree with him at all, because obviously we need to solve the energy problem in the interim. The question is, however, how rapidly do we dial that down? And is 20 gigawatts the target that they've set for 2030? And I'm not talking about him specifically, but for all oil and gas companies, can they be more ambitious in those targets? And can they channelize more capital into these?
We'll have Josu Jon answer that, but it's going to be a bumpy road, so, get your lock in your seat belts. But how do you deal with this?
It's not an easy balance, because, we are tough in our decarbonization targets, and we are transforming our products. We are trying to produce diesel, gasoline, and gases more and more with in a less carbonized way. So reducing the global footprint, changing in some way the feedstock we are using. But we have a responsibility. We have to produce the products that society needs. And the oil is going to stay there. And it's going to stay there for decades, even in a world that is going to be fully decarbonized. And in Europe, we forgot that we have to produce natural gas. And the consequence has been building this dependence on Russia. So I think that we have to balance, of course, this investment
effort. Sorry to interrupt, Josu Jon. So are you saying in the interim you will increase your investments in oil and gas exploration?
No, what we are doing is trying to sustain the current production we have, around 600,000 barrels per day. And we are increasing more and more the effort we are developing to invest in less carbonized technologies, mainly renewable power, and also producing the carbonized liquid. So we are shifting. We have a clear target to shift. We have to join the effort of the society in this roadmap. But again, I think that we have to maintain and sustain this balance in the whole society. And in Europe, perhaps we broke this balance. We have good models. Take the American one. The IRA is the model of the carrot. The European one is the model of the stick. The Americans, they have technological neutrality with no biases. They produce gas. They are betting in favor of carbon capture, use, and storage. They are defining a predictable horizon of 10 years, very clear to invest. They have simple rules. So they could be a model in this decarbonization effort. So my point is, we need to have a more clever, a more intelligent energy transition framework in Europe, because otherwise we are going to fail in the three targets of the trilemma as we are today.
So Darius, before I bring in maybe a couple of questions from the floor, does the so-called carrot of the IRA trigger more innovation, and how so? How much would innovation versus disruption, determine the way you are looking at your business plans?
Well, no question the IRA is going to be helpful, because it puts a real economic value on investment on carbon. That's because prior to the IRA, there was sort of an ambiguous figure, and I think we've got a line in the sand in terms of what is the real economic value, because as we talk about the energy transition, there are four, maybe more things that matter. The first one is resilience. We talked a lot about that. Two is technology, what's feasible. Three is economics. At the end of the day, economics matter. If we could wave the magic wand, we'd probably all sitting here on stage want renewable energy at an economic value tomorrow. I certainly would. I think probably all my panelists would as well. But that's not realistic, because you have to balance that with economics. And trying to balance all these things is very difficult. That's why this path is not straight and simple. But I think the IRA is a good step.
And what's the fourth?
The fourth is, I said technology, resilience, economics, and just national sovereignty. I mean, there are not national sovereignty issues and protection of, sort of nations and the choices they made. So,
but this
it may go resilience, but
issue comes up.
But your point is important.
Hold your thoughts.
We need more technology and less ideology to redress this problem.
More technology, less ideology. All right. We are at just under 5 minutes remaining. So let's just gather a couple of questions from the floor. If anyone is burning with a question, especially about magic wands. Yes, sir. Could we pass a microphone right up front?
Hi, my name is Neeraj. I'm from Crescent Petroleum. So this is a question for you. Mm-hmm. We heard yesterday some very dramatic figures about growth of India's economy, from $3 trillion to $27 trillion in the next 20, 25 years. India is importing around 4.2 million barrels of oil a day, but it's essentially a coal-dependent overall energy mix. My question to you is, as someone who's a practitioner in that economy, how much of that mix do you see changing directionally?
All right. Can we get one more question in before I go back to the panel, in the interest of time, in case there's a... Yes, sir. If you could also introduce us.
My name is Monge Zveti, working for...
Could you stand up, please? Then the live stream audience will be able to see you.
Yes. Monge Zveti, Executive Head Sustainability at Exxaro in South Africa. The question I'd like to ask perhaps to all the panelists, it's about just transition. At what stage that the forums of this nature, in all the conversations, begin to put just transition at the core of all the discussions? And also the question of disparities between the global north and the global south with respect to the development of respective economies, taking advantage of the cheapest resource, which unfortunately my country has, coal, that which the minister has also mentioned about, which results into devastation with respect to communities. Okay. When is this issue going to be integrated in this?
I mean, in fact, we started this whole conversation with the minister's comments. So, and the two questions are related in a way. There are three countries. There's India, Colombia, South Africa, much dependent on coal, but there's also a transition underway. But the general question to all four of you before we close out is, how would you define justice in the energy transition from your perspectives? Maybe I'll go in reverse order.
I talk about just transition when we were talking about maintaining our industrial jobs, transforming our refineries, giving opportunities to our workers to be part of this new energy economy. So for me, just transition is a transition where we use all the technologies that could contribute to decarbonize the world, and we give the opportunity to all the sectors, all the fuels, and all the activities to decarbonize themselves with no biases, with no ideology, with no restrictions saying that some sectors, some fuels are out of this equation. That is, for me, and the trilemma, when I talk the trilemma, and I was talking about the problems for families to pay energy bills, and the problems of industries that were shutting down, I was talking about just transition.
Fair enough, but I would argue that justice itself is an ideology, but I get the general point you're making. Darius, what does just transition look like from the U.S.?
Well, I think from my perspective, I think we have to have a level of respect and the fact that we need a holistic plan. We share the planet, and a plan that may be appropriate for the U.S. or Western Europe or India or whatever it may be maybe a bit different than it be for some of the other countries. So I think we have to recognize that, respect that. We have to take a look at the economics of it and sort of, support that other nations provide a timeline. But the single most important thing is we have to engage all the nations, all the continents in this, because it doesn't matter whether Western Europe decarbonizes or US or the world has to decarbonize.
Okay.
And we have to have a level of respect for the differences in how that's done.
Sumant?
Yeah, for me, just transition actually from an energy standpoint, energy has to be available to everybody at an affordable price and in a manner that does not spoil the planet. And that to me is really the elements of a just transition. And for people who don't even get electricity, let alone worrying about how they can pay the bill, I think that's really the large part of the sort of the world's population that we also have to worry about. Now, for those people, for a lot of those people, coal is the natural answer today. And we have to find ways of weaning off this whole thought process that coal is the best solution and develop solutions around renewable-based technologies, which I think is eminently possible today. And I think that really is the answer to India's growth as well, that the government is pushing forward on renewables. Coal will start getting dialed down, but our growth is just so much. And that will happen to all emerging economies, that it will take us some time before renewable capacity growth catches up to power demand growth and then bends the coal curve down. Okay. I suspect we'll reach peak coal in India between 2030 and 2035. Every other economy is going to be on a different path, and the same applies to South Africa.
Minister, very quickly.
Lo primero es que creo que hay una...
First of all, I believe that there is a global perspective of justice, and I agree with the fact that we all must do our part. We all must do our bit. However, there's a differential relationship between North and South, and that is absolutely essential to understand global justice. And that is also related to the moral responsibility that the countries that have produced most of the CO2 emissions have. Countries which are nowadays generating a highest impact on the global south geographies that are perceiving the biggest impact of those emissions. Therefore, there needs to be a compensation and a different geopolitical balance for that. And there's a different scale, which is the national scale. And on a national scale, for us, justice in energy transition has got 4 principles. 1, it should be gradual, and it should offer energy security. That's one of the keys. 2, it should also be democratic. For us, it is essential to democratize energy generation so that it is not concentrated in energy generator, because once there's a concentration, there's a higher prices and more manipulation of prices. 3rd is knowledge. We need to be knowledge intensive, and that requires investment in education and research. And finally, binding social participation. This needs to be an agreement between citizens. It needs to be a social and political agreement where people feel that this is the way forward that we all need to take on. And for that, participation is absolutely essential.
Maslow's pyramid, we've heard about recalibration, we've heard about jobs, growth, sustainability, volatility. But I think 3 things that come to my mind as I try to summarize is, 1, energy security and energy independence are different, and what kind of interdependent energy security we can get. 2nd, there is a leapfrog potential, and there is a transition, and countries will chart different ways to decide between the 2. And 3rd is that there is national sovereignty, national policy around industrial policy, and then there is a global story unfolding as well. The Indian G20 presidency that's underway right now has a theme: one world, one earth, one future. I think that's the theme that all 4 of you have ended on. Thank you so much for your candor and for your very, very remarkable remarks. Irene, Velez, Torres, Sumant Sinha, Darius Adamczyk, and Josu Jon Imaz. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for your engagement.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
No, Adamczyk.